Hello young dold, welcome to Best Around. Today we're going to be looking at the game The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was released in Japan as Zelda no Densetsu Kamigami no Triforce, meaning The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods, on the 21st of November 1991, in April 1992 in the US, and September 92 for PAL regions. My background with the game was playing the game for half an hour or less a few times in the early 2000s and then finishing the game in 2024. Since 2024 I had also beaten the first two Zelda games, though that makes up the majority of my experience with the series. For those with limited familiarity with the series, there were two Zelda games on the NES. The Legend of Zelda, which was a top-down action adventure, whilst the sequel had a combination of top-down and a side-scrolling battle screen for dungeons and random encounters. The latter also had pronounced RPG elements, with some of that still within this game, which I will mention later. Put quite simply, you start off having to save Zelda, who is communicating with you telepathically. The music is memorable and sets the scene. The intensity is there within the game, even from the very first minute. The graphics are good throughout, though I did initially think Link looked a bit chubby, but it's just the clothes that give off that optical illusion sometimes. Everything is really clear and the bosses look great. There will never really be any complaint with the graphics. They're as good as you will ever want or need on the console. The buildings and backgrounds look fantastic, and there's a large open world to discover with very distinctive looking regions. The battle system looks quite similar to the original, but the arc of Link's sword swing adds a new element to the game, as does charging for a full sword swipe which can attack enemies in all directions. This is likely where the similarities end, as the game's battle system gets much more expansive as time goes on, having bow and arrows, bombs, being able to throw the bombs, charge attack, hook, and some fire and ice spells also. Battling is at the very heart of the game, and they've done it really well. Hit detection is not optimal, but it's not noticeably bad. And the most epic battles are of course boss battles, and as I've seen across a lot of games on this system, they're a real highlight. The dungeons are also mostly great, with some interesting puzzles. I've been playing games for over 30 years, and one puzzle I found had creativity that I hadn't seen before. A simple block on a switch which opened not just the door nearest to you, but also one of them that is out of screen to the right. This is perhaps a little bit cheap, but it is also a little bit tricky, and it shows that not always as it seems, which is a very true description for the game. There are creative solutions to the puzzles, though I have seen better use of things like bombs, hooks and hammers within dungeons in another SNES title, which I felt took elements of this game and improved upon them. There's a lot of layers to this game. It is action based, there is an adventure component and exploration, there's a cohesive story, and there's also some RPG aspects. It's not just when you do things to help progress the story, but also I would dub this an invisible RPG, wherein there's stats for your attack and defense, and it changes as you advance through the game and get improved equipment. These stats, though numerical within the game code, are never visible. One of my few deaths was when I faced a boss without the optimal armour, and it made an enormous difference when I returned with the optimal armour. It seemed a totally different battle, and this is of course what you can come to expect within a lot of JRPGs of its time. One aspect of it being a shallow RPG at best is that there's in essence only one town. Yes, the different world has a differently named town, but it's still pretty much the same. There's no doubt that the creators of the game wanted to steer well clear of the more RPG heavy elements of Zelda 2. In terms of difficulty, I think it's quite appropriate. The NES titles, namely Zelda 2, were certainly less forgiving. As this was my second playthrough, I could tell I'd become much more skilled at the game and more aware of my limitations. I died a lot less and was more conservative in my decision making. These genres are not ones I have a heap of familiarity with, but I felt that it was a good amount of challenge and never unreasonable. I would suggest you retreat to safety rather than push through generally. If you do weasel it through all the way to the boss with limited health or magic, you may well find yourself in a lot of trouble. The amount of secrets in the game was very high. It almost feels like a PlayStation game in that there's so much to find. I would also say that the overwhelming majority of these secrets can be found without using assistance, such as a fantastic Link to the Past shrine at rpgclassics.com. The limit to the bombs can suck a little bit, and I thought the medallions didn't really need to be in the game, let alone be essential for progress. A slight downside is the puzzles in terms of pushing and pulling blocks and pillars. Generally, I've been used to games where you could either always push or both push/pull any block or column or whatnot. This stems from Soccer Band on the PC, where the general concept was that you can push blocks, but then once they reach a wall you can't get them off the wall. There was consistency. Here, unfortunately, it's quite inconsistent. Some blocks you can push, some you can pull, they look absolutely no different, and there's no way of definitively knowing what you can do with blocks unless you try pushing and pulling all of them. Pulling in particular was quite weird in that I can only recall about 2 different instances where you needed to pull to continue, but it was an almost non-existent ability given how rarely you could do it. The confusion as to what can be pushed or pulled takes a bit of fun out of the game at times, as there's screens with a lot of blocks and you can burn through a fair bit of time for nothing gained. It's something I did a lot of in my first playthrough. Now, one could say it's realistic in that if you go in a real life dungeon and there's things that may appear movable, but you only know for sure from trial and error. This could be a case of what you were first exposed to you'll prefer, but for me it's a bit of a no-brainer. This game does this poorly, and it's also a bit annoying when certain blocks can be moved, but you can only move them one space. It doesn't really make any sense, and again, because I've seen this done far better in other games, it just looks like lazy game design here. Another puzzle in particular which I thought was odd was in a dungeon where you find a maiden, and she asked to be taken outside. The dungeon only had one door going in, so being a smarty, I used the mirror to take me to that entrance/exit. But the maiden says that this is the wrong way. Slight spoiler, the answer was to take her to a room. Now, it might not be that surprising which room it is, but it's a weird puzzle in which the outside is a room which has sunlight on it. When you take the maiden towards other rooms that have light, she also says it's the wrong way. This wasn't awful, it could be a bit of a mistranslation. If it isn't though, the request made by the maiden is quite obtuse. I'd imagine many a game in the 90s progressed here out of luck or by word of mouth. The puzzles were mostly a hit though, especially in terms of creativity, but they were of course by no means flawless throughout. The dual worlds, whilst groundbreaking for its time, were also a little bit of a muddle. Why can you warp from anywhere in the light world to the dark world, but not anywhere in the dark world back to the light? Why does the item that teleports you through worlds also take you to the entrance of a dungeon? Again, another SNES game did the reset function a lot better than this, and whilst it's full marks for the creativity of dual worlds, it was a bit messy at times. The last downsides that I'll mention are the final dungeon and the final boss. Though I must mention, the downsides are really just nitpicking. There's so many great aspects about this game. The final dungeon I found to be a bit of a chore getting to it, especially if you're light on potions and you want to buy some and return. It was a bit of a slog getting through the tower, and I can't say it was enjoyable despite the moderate challenge. The last boss, I don't want to spoil too much by showing it, but I thought it was a bit poor. At least in my experiences from playing through the game twice, you don't really die in the battle, even if you don't win per se. You can be knocked off the edge, and then you just climb up the outside of the building and go into the room where the boss is, and you just start anew. I think a really great game like this deserved a better final opponent. It is a bit creative, and it was somewhat a homage to the original on the NES with the invisibility, but I thought it was a disappointment. Something I did love about the game though was the after-game credits and ending to the story. They were a positive, as was the little deaths recap. I think in my first playthrough I died about 60 odd times, but in this second playthrough, just 4. When it comes to replayability, I think most people would want to play through it again, and I'd consider giving it a go again someday to try and finish it without any deaths. It took me 14 hours to finish, probably about half of what it took me first time round. Though I seemed a bit confused as to where to go in my first playthrough, and I elected not to go see the fortune teller, which is very foolish. Despite the criticisms I have given, I did enjoy the majority of my time playing through the game, and I'd even say that I found the game to be a better playthrough second time round. This is obviously a very good sign when this happens. I'd give the game an 8.25 out of 10 for enjoyability. The early Dark World ventures aren't always enjoyable, but most of the game certainly is. In terms of difficulty, I'd give the game a 6.5 out of 10. There's tricky aspects, mainly the end and the Ice Palace, but it's difficulty where you knuckle down a bit and you are happy that you made it through. In terms of whether it's a top 10 game, there's material for both sides of the argument. The game is not perfect, but it is outstanding for 1991, and it undoubtedly has that pick up and play quality more than 30 years later. However, this game was released very early in the SNES lifespan. There's nearly 5 full years of SNES lifespan that came after this before the next home Nintendo console was released. One thing that does help the case though is that in terms of all the SNES games I've ever played, this is definitely the best of the action-adventure genre. There's an enormous amount of depth, adequate challenge, replayability, and I can see people putting in 20 or even 30 hours in a playthrough. There is a big world to explore, and it would have been mind-blowing for its time. Given I am going through my list of games chronologically, there's no comparison in terms of the magnitude of this game with what I have already reviewed thus far. In terms of quality though, the game most similar of the ones I've reviewed thus far to this one is Super Mario World. Both are really good to great games, iconic entries of iconic series. Now whilst I enjoyed Super Mario World more, there are two big advantages that A Link to the Past has in determining whether it is top 10 material. For one, it is a much larger game, possibly taking somebody 3 or 4 times as long to finish it. I can see people having 20 plus or even 30 plus hour playthroughs, especially if they're going in blind and not using a guide, and especially if they're trying to find everything that there is to find in this game. It is harder for me to see as much greatness in a 10-hour game compared to one of similar quality that is much longer. Secondly, and more importantly, in terms of action-adventure games, albeit with minor RPG elements, A Link to the Past is, of the games I've played, the best in the genre by some distance. I had said in the Super Mario World video that I would only say a game is definitively a top 10 on the console if the game is a top contender for best game on the console. This can't really be done for a game that is not the best of its genre, but it can for A Link to the Past. Now whilst I didn't enjoy playing it as much as Super Mario World, and part of that may be due to fairly large differences in my previous playtime, it is a bigger, better game than Super Mario World, and it is likely a bigger and better game than most SNES games that you will ever come across. So despite getting a lower score than Super Mario World, I do think, for now at least, that A Link to the Past is a top 10 Super Nintendo game. Stay tuned for the next game chronologically in the series, and I'll see you all next time.